Alice Munro, An Appreciation, 2008. Alice Munro is among the major writers of English fiction of our time. She's been accorded armful of superlatives by critics in both North America and United Kingdom. She's won many awards, and she has a devoted international readership. Among writers themselves, her name is spoken in hushed tones. Most recently, she's been used as a stick to flog the enemy with. In various interwriterly combats, "You call this writing?" the floggers say, in effect. "Alice Munro. Now that's writing." She's the kind of writer about whom it is often said, no matter how well known she becomes, that she ought to be better known. None of this happened overnight. Alice Munro has been writing since the 1960s, and her first collection, Dance of the Happy Shades, appeared in 1968. To date, and including her latest, the rapturously received Runaway 2004, she has published 10 collections, average 9 or 10 stories each. Though her fiction has been a regular feature in The New Yorker since the 1970s, her recent elevation to international literary sainthood took as long as it did, partly because of the form in which she writes. She's a writer of stories, short stories as they used to be called, or short fiction, which is now more common. Though many Americans and British and Canadian writers of the first rank have practiced this form, there is still a widespread but false tendency to equate length with importance. Thus, Alice Munro has been among these writers subject to periodic rediscovery, at least outside of Canada. It's as if she jumps out of a cake. Surprise! And then she has to jump out of it again. And then again. Readers don't see her name in the lights on every billboard. They come across her as if by fate or accident and are drawn in, and then there is an outbreak of wonder and excitement and incredulity. Where did Alice Munro come from? Why did anybody tell me? How can such excellence have sprung from nowhere? But Alice Munro did not spring from nowhere. She sprang, though it's a verb her characters would often overly sprightly and indeed pretentious, from Huron County in southwestern Ontario. Ontario is a large province of Canada that stretches from Ottawa River to the western end of Lake Superior. This is a huge and varied space, but southwestern Ontario is a distinct part of it. It was named Sowesto by the painter Greg Curnow, a name that has stuck. Curnow's view was that Sowesto was an area of considerable interest, but also of considerable psychic darkness and oddity, a view shared by many. Robertson Davies, also from Sowesto, used to say, "I know the dark folk ways of my people," and Alice Munro knows them too. You are likely to run into quite a few sites in Sylvester wheat fields telling you to be prepared to meet your God or else your doom, felt to be much the same thing. Lake Huron lies on the western edge of Sylvester, Lake Erie to the south. The country is mostly flat farmland cut by several wide, winding rivers prone to flooding, and on the rivers, because of the available boat transport and the power provided by water-driven mills, a number of smaller and larger towns grew up in the 19th century. Each has its red brick town hall, usually with a tower, each its post office building, and its handful of churches of varied denominations, each its main street and its residential section of gracious homes, and its residential section on the wrong side of the tracks. Each has its families with long memories and stashes of bones in the closets. Sowesto contains the site of the famously Donnelly massacre of the 19th century, where a large family was slaughtered and their home burned as a result of political resentments carried over from Ireland. Lush nature, repressed emotions, respectable fronts, hidden sexual excesses, outbreak of violence, lurid crimes, long held grudges, strange rumors, none are ever far away from Munro's Sowesto, partly because all have been provided by the real life of the region itself. Oddly enough, a number of writers have come from Sylvester. Oddly, because when Alice Munro was growing up in the 1930s and 1940s, the idea of a person from Canada, but especially one from a small town southwest Ontario, thinking they could be a writer to be taken seriously in the world at large was laughable. Even by 1950s and 1960s, there were very few publishers in Canada, and even they were mostly textbook publishers who imported whatever so-called literature was to be had from England and the United States. There might be some amateur theater, high school performances, little theater groups. There was, however, the radio. In the 1960s. Alice Munro got her start through a CBC program called Anthology, produced by Robert Weaver. But very few Canadian writers of any sort were known to an international readership, and it was taken for granted that if you had hankerings of that kind, hankerings about which you would, of course, feel defensive and ashamed because art was not something a grown up, morally credible person would fool around with, it would be best for you if you leave the country. Everyone knew that writing was not a thing you could ever expect to make your living at. It might be marginally acceptable to dabble around the edge of watercolor painting or poetry if you were a certain kind of a man described by Munro in The Turkey Season. There were homosexuals in the town, and we knew who they were. An elegant, light voiced, wavy haired paperhanger called himself an interior decorator. The minister's widow's fat, spoiled only son, who went so far as to enter baking contests and had crocheted a tablecloth. A hypochondriacal church organist and the music teacher who kept the choir and his pupils in line with screaming tantrums. Or you could do art as a hobby if you were a woman with time on your hands, or you could scrape out a living at some poorly paid quasi artistic job. Munro's stories are sprinkled with women like this. They go in for piano playing or writing chatty newspaper columns, or more tragically, they have real, though small talent, like Almeda Roth in Manastirng, but there is no context for them. Almeda produces one volume of minor verse published in 1873 called Offerings. The local paper, the Vedette, referred to her as our poetess. There seemed to be a mixture of respect and contempt both for calling and for her sex, or for their predictable conjecture. At the beginning of the story, Almeda is a maiden lady whose family has died. She lives alone, preserves her good name, and does charitable works. But at the end, the dammed up river of art has overflowed, helped on by hefty doses of laudanum lace painkiller, and sweeps her rational self away. Poems, even. Yes, again, poems. Or one poem. Isn't that idea one very great poem that will contain everything, and oh, that will make all other poems, the poems she has written, inconsequential, mere trial and error, mere rags? The name of the poem is the name of the river. No, in fact, it is the river, the Menestong. Almeda took deep, deep into the river of her mind and into the tablecloth, and she sees crochet roses floating. This seems to be the fate of an artist of necessity, a minor artist in the small Sylvester town of yore, silent and enforced by need of respectability, or else an eccentric verging on madness. If you move to the larger Canadian city, you might at least find a few others of your ilk, but in the small towns of Sylvester, you'd be on your own. Nevertheless, John Kenneth Galbraith, Robert Davies, Marian Angel, Graham Gibson, and James Rainey all came out of Sylvester, and Alice Munro herself, after a spell on the West Coast, moved back there, and lives at present not far from Wingham, the prototype of the various Jubilees and Valleys and Dagleys and Handreys in her stories. To Munro's fiction, Sylvester's Huron County has joined Faulkner's Yoknapatawpha County as a slice of land made legendary by the excellence of the writer who has celebrated it. Though in both cases, celebrated is not quite the right word. Anatomized might be closer to what goes on in the work of Munro, though even that term is too clinical. What should be called a combination of obsessive scrutiny, archaeological unearthing, precise and detailed recollection, the wallowing in the seamer and meaner and more vengeful undersides of human nature, the telling of erotic secrets, the nostalgia for vanished mysteries, and rejoicing in the fullness and variety of lives stirred all together. At the end of Monroe's Lives of the Girls and Women, 1971, her only novel and a Bilderstrung roman, a novel of development, in this case a portrait of artist as a young girl, there's a telling passage. Del Jordan of Jubilee, who has by now, true to her last name, crossed over into the promised land of womanhood and also of writerhood, says of her adolescence, "It did not occur to me then that one day I would be so greedy for Jubilee. Voracious and misguided as Uncle Craig out of Jennings Bend, writing his history, I would want to write things written down. I would try to make lists, a list of the stores and the businesses going up and down the main street and who owned them, a list of family names, names on tombstones in the cemetery, and any inscriptions underneath. The hope of accuracy will bring to such tasks crazy, heartbreaking, and no list could hold what I wanted, for what I wanted was every last thing, every layer of speech and thought, stroke of light on bark and walls, every smell, pothole, pain, crack, delusion, held still and held together, radiant, everlasting. As a program for a life's work, this is daunting. Nevertheless, it's a program Alice Munro was to follow over the next 35 years with remarkable fidelity. Alice Munro was born Alice Laidlaw in 1931, which means she was a small child during the Depression. She was 8 in 1939, the year Canada entered the Second World War, and attended university, the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario, in the post-war years. She was 25 and a young mother when Elvis Presley became famous, and 38 at the time of the Flower Child Revolution and the advent of women's movement in 1968 to 69, a movement in time that saw the publication of her first book. In 1981, she was 50. Her stories are set mainly over these years, the 1930s to the 1980s, or even before then, in the time of ancestral memory. Her own ancestry was partly Scottish Presbyterian. She can trace her family back to James Hogg, the Ettrick's shepherd, friend of Robert Burns, an Edinburgh literati of the late 18th century and the author of the Private Memoirs and the Confession of Justified Sinner, which could itself be a Munro title. On the other side of the family there were Anglicans, for whom the worst sin is said to consist of using the wrong fork at dinner. Munro's acute consciousness of social class and of minutiae and sneers separating one level from the next is honestly come by as it is from the Presbyterian, her character's habit of rigorously examining their own deeds, emotions, motives, and consciences, and finding them wanting. In a traditional Protestant culture, such as that of small towns of Westo, forgiveness is not easily to come by. Punishments are frequent and harsh. Potential humiliation and shame lurk around every corner, and nobody gets away with much. But this tradition also contains the doctrine of justification by faith alone. Grace descends upon us without any action on our part. In Munro's work, grace abounds, but it is strangely disguised. Nothing can be predicted. Emotions erupt, preconceptions crumble, astonishments leap out. Malicious acts can have positive consequences. Salvation arrives when least expected and in peculiar forms. But as soon as you make such a pronouncement about Monroe's writing or any other such analysis, inference, or generalization about it, you're aware of that mocking commentator so often present in Monroe's story. The one who says, in essence, "What do you think you are? What gives you the right to think you know everything about me? Or about anyone else for that matter?" Or to quote from the lives of girls and women again, people's lives were dull, simple, amazing, and unfathomable. Deep caves paved with kitchen linoleum. The key word here is unfathomable. The first two stories in this selection, Royal Beatings and The Beggar Maid, are from a book with three different titles. In Canada, it was called after a term of peevish accusation used to let the air out of somebody's puffed head. "What do you think you are?" In England, it was called plainly and simply Rose and Flo, and in the United States, it was called romantically The Beggar Maid. The stories in this enigmatically titled book have a common protagonist, Rose, who grows up in a poorer section of a town called Henratty with her father and her stepmother, Flo. Then goes to university on scholarship, marries a man from a social level far above hers, and later runs away from him, and then later still becomes an actress. A cardinal sin and cause for shame in Andrade, still inhibited by Flo. "What do you think you are?" is thus another Bildungsroman, an account for the formation of its heroine, and another portrait of the artist. What is fakery? What is authenticity? Which emotions and modes of the behavior and speech are honest and true, which pretend or pretentious? Or can they be separated? Munro's characters think frequently about such matters. And in art, so in life, Hanratty society is divided into two by a river that flows through the town. In Hanratty, the social structure ran from the doctors and the dentists and the lawyers down to factory workers and draymen. In West Hanratty, it ran from factory workers, foundry workers, down to large improvident families of casual bootleggers and prostitutes and unsuccessful thieves. Each half of the town claims juring rights against the other. Flo goes through to Henratty, the better part of the town, to shop, but also to see people and listen to them. Among the people she listened to were Mrs. Lawyer Davis, Mrs. Angelican Rector Henley Smith, and Mrs. Horse Doctor McKay. She came home and imitated her flibberty voices. Monsters, she made them seem, of foolishness and showiness and self approbation. But when Rose goes to college and boards with a lady professor and becomes engaged to Patrick, son of a West Coast department store tycoon, and gets a look at upper middle class surroundings, Flo in turn becomes monstrous in Rose's eyes, and Rose is divided against herself. Patrick's visit to Rose's hometown is a disaster for Rose. She felt ashamed on more levels than she could count. She was ashamed of the food and the swan and the plastic tablecloth, ashamed for Patrick, the gloomy snob, who made a startled grimace when Flo passed him the toothpick holder, ashamed for Flo when her timidity and hypocrisy and pretensions, most of all ashamed for herself. She didn't even have any way that she could talk and sound natural. Yet, as soon as begins to criticize her town and family, Rose feels a layer of loyalty and protectiveness hardening around every memory she had. The state of divided allegiance applies to Monroe's vocation as well as to considerations of social status. Her fictional world is peopled with secondary characters who despise art and artifice in any kind of pretentiousness or showing off. It's against their attitudes and the self mistrust they inspire that her central characters must struggle in order to free themselves enough to create anything at all. Yet at the same time, our protagonists share their scorn of artificial side of art and the distrust of it. What should be written about it? How should one write? How much of art is genuine? How much of it is just a bag of cheap tricks, imitating people, manipulating their emotions, making faces? How can one confirm anything about another person, even a made up person, without presumption? Above all, how should a story end? Munro often provides one ending, then questions or revises it. Or else she simply distrusts it, as in the final paragraph or of Menacing, where the narrator says, I may have got it all wrong. Isn't the very act of writing an act of arrogance? Isn't the pen a broken reed? A number of stories, Friend of My Youth, Carried Away, Wilderness Station, Hateship, Friendship, Courtship, Loveship, Marriage contain letters that display the vanity or falsity or even the malice of their writers. If the writings of letters can be so devious, what about writings itself? This tension has remained with her, as in The Moons of the Jupiter, Munro's artistic characters are punished for not succeeding, but they are punished also for success. The woman writer thinking about her father says, I could hear him saying, well, I didn't see anything about you in McKillion's. And if he had read something about me, he would say, well, I didn't think too much of the write up. His tone would be humorous and indulgent, but would produce to me a familiar dreariness of spirit. The message I got from him was simple. Fame must be striven for, then apologized for. Getting or not getting it, you will be to blame. Dreariness of spirit is one of the great Munro enemies. Her characters do battle with it every way they can, fighting against stifling mores and other people's deadening expectations and imposed rules of behavior and every possible kind of muffling and spiritual smothering. Given a choice between being a person who does good works but has inauthentic feelings and is numb at heart, and one who behaves badly but is true to what she really feels and is thus alive to herself, a Monroe woman is likely to choose the latter. Or if she chooses the former, she will then comment on her own slipperiness, guile, villainous, slyness, and perversity. Honestly, in Monroe's work is not the best policy. It is not a policy at all, but an essential element like air. The characters must get hold of at least some of it by means fair or foul, or they feel they will go under. The battle for authenticity is waged most significantly in the field of sex. The Monroe social world, like most of the societies in which silence and secrecy are the norm in sexual matters, carries a high erotic charge, and this charge extends like a neon penumbra around each character, illuminating landscapes, rooms, and objects. A rumpled bed says more in the hands of Monroe than any graphic in out depiction of genitalia ever could. Even if a story is not primarily about a love affair or sexual encounter, men and women are always aware of another as men and women, positively or negatively, recognizing sexual attraction and curiosity or else sexual revulsion. Women are immediately attuned to the sexual power of other women and are wary of it or envious. Men show off and preen and flirt and seduce and compete. Munro's characters are as alert as dogs in the perfume store to the sexual chemistry in a gathering, the chemistry among others, as well as their own visceral responses. Falling in love, falling in lust, sneaking around on spouses and enjoying it, telling sexual lies, doing shameful things they felt compelled to do out of irresistible desire, making sexual calculations based on social desperation. Few writers have explored such processes more thoroughly and more ruthlessly. Pushing the sexual boundaries is distinctly thrilling for many a Munro woman, but in order to trespass, you have to know exactly where the fence is, and Munro's universe is crisscrossed with meticulously defined boundaries. Hands, chairs, glances, all are part of an intricate inner map strewn with barbed wire and booby traps and secret pots throughout the shrubbery. For women of Monroe's generation, sexual expression was a liberation and a way out. But out of what? Out of denial and limiting scorn she described so well in the turkey season. Lily said she never let her husband come near her if he had been drinking. Marjorie said since the time she nearly died with a hemorrhage, she never let her husband come near her, period. Lily said quickly that it was only when he had been drinking that he tried anything. I could see that it was a matter of pride not to let your husband come near you, but I couldn't quite believe that come near meant have sex. For older women like Lily and Marjorie to enjoy sex would have been humiliating defeat. For women like Rose and the beggar maid, it's a matter for pride and celebration, a victory. For later generations of women, post sexual revolution, enjoying sex was to become simply a duty, the perfect orgasm, yet another thing to add in their list of required accomplishments. And when enjoyment becomes a duty, we're back in the hand of dreariness of spirit. But for a Monroe character in the throes of sexual exploration, the spirit may be confused and ashamed and tormented, even cruel and sadistic. Some of the couples in our stories get pleasure out of torturing each other emotionally, just like some real people. But it is never dreary. In some of the later stories, sex can be less impetuous, more calculated. For Grant, in The Bear Come Over the Mountain, it's the decisive element in an astonishing feat of emotional commodities trading. His beloved wife Fiona has dementia and has become attached to the similarly afflicted man in her care facility. When this man taken home by his heart-bitten, practical wife Marianne, Fiona pines and stops eating. Grant wants to persuade Mariana to put her husband back in the institution. Marianne refuses. It would cost too much. But Grant detects that Marianne is lonely and sexually available. She has a wrinkled face, but her body is still attractive. Like an adroit salesman, Grant moves in to close the deal. Monroe knows full well that sex can be a glory and a torment, but it can also be a bargaining chip. The society Monroe writes about is a Christian one. This Christianity is not often overt, it's merely the general background. Flo and the beggar maid decorates the wall with a number of admonitions, pious and cheerful and mildly bawdy. The Lord is my shepherd, believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved. Why did Flo have those when she wasn't even religious? They were what people had common as calendars. Christianity is what people had, and in Canada, church and state were never separated along the lines laid down in United States. Prayers and Bible readings were daily fare in publicly funded schools. This cultural Christianity has provided ample material for Monroe, but it is also connected with one of the most distinctive patterns in her image making and storytelling. The central Christian tenet is that two disparate and mutually exclusive elements, divinity and humanity, got jammed together in Christ, neither annihilating the other. The result was not a demigod or a god in disguise. God became a totally human being while remaining at the same time totally divine. To believe that Christ was only a man and to believe he was simply God was both declared heretical by the early Christian church. Christianity thus depends on the denial of either or, classifying logic, and an acceptance of both at once mystery. Logic says that A cannot be both itself and non A at the same time. Christianity says it can. The formulation A but also not non A is indispensable to it. Many of Munro's stories resolve themselves, or fail to resolve themselves, in precisely this way. The example that first came to mind, though there are many, is from Lives of Girls and Women, in which the teacher who staged the high school's airy and joyful operettas drowned herself in the river. Miss Ferris in her velvet skating costume, Miss Ferris contrario, Miss Ferris floating face down and protesting in the Vashava River 6 days before she was found. Though there is no plausible way of hanging those pictures together, it is the last one is true, and then might it not alter all the others? They are going to have to stay together now. For Monroe, a thing can be true, but not true, but true nonetheless. It is real and dishonest. Things of Georgia, of her remorse indifferently. How hard it is for me to believe that I made that up, says the narrator of The Progress of Love. It seems so much the truth, it is the truth. It's what I believe about them. I haven't stopped believing it. The world is profane and sacred. It must be swallowed whole. There's always more to be known about it than you can ever know. In a story called Something I've Been Meaning to Tell You, jealous Ed describes his sister's former lover, a promiscuous ladies' man, and the look he gives to every woman. A look that made him seem to be deep sea diver diving down, down through all the emptiness and cold and wreckage to discover the one thing he had set his heart on. Something small and precious, hard to locate, a ruby maybe on the ocean floor. Munro's story abound in such questionable seekers and well-fingered ploys, but they abound also in such insights. Within any story, within any human being, there may be a dangerous treasure, a priceless ruby, a heart's desire.